Are Nakobe Dean and Devin White enough to fix the Eagles' everlasting linebacker problems, which continue to hurt them in 2023? We'll get into it as we preview linebacker on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm one of your two hosts, Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. You can also find our work over at Bleacher Report. On today's edition of Locked On Eagles, we continue our positional previews with linebacker. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Linebacker, as I mentioned earlier, it's always the problem child for the Eagles, it feels like. I mean, there's a rarity. It feels like one every 4 to 5 years where, wow, Nigel Bradham was really good for the Eagles this year. Hey, we actually had Kyzir White and TJ Edwards bring some stability. But, for the majority of our lives in the post-Jeremiah Trotter world, this has been the position that the Eagles spend the least amount of resources at. They don't feel like it's a primary position to build around, which I agree with, as do you. But they've taken it to some extreme levels at times. This year, I wouldn't say that they completely ignored it. Last year, they did. Like, they let TJ Edwards walk and Kyzir White, banked on Nakobe Dean, only brought in Nicholas Morrow. Even when Dean went down, they didn't really try hard to bring in any other sort of talent. This year with Dean and Devin White, I think this year's position, I think it has a low floor like they always do, but this might be the highest ceiling the Eagles have had at this position in quite some time.
A big if when it comes to the
Huge
linebacker. And that seems to be the trend each and every year for this position. And like you had said, outside of the Kyzir White, TJ Edwards Super Bowl run, even in the 2017 Super Bowl, outside of Nigel Bradham, you really didn't have anybody that elevated their game.
Hicks got hurt, so it was really just Nigel.
Now, what they absolutely need, bare minimum, Lou, is one of these guys, regardless of who it is, to be healthy for a full season, to have continuity at the green dot play caller position, because that was the one thing that absolutely killed this defense, especially late into the season when they couldn't protect the pass and they couldn't defend the run. It's because the guys didn't know where to go. They couldn't get to their spots. They couldn't hit their landmarks. They need somebody that can be the consistent quarterback for them, down in and down out. And that's why TJ Edwards, maybe he had a limited ceiling, but you at least knew you were going to get a solid tackler, somebody who's going to fill the gap when he needs to, somebody that's going to get everybody in the right position. Hopefully Nakobe Dean, if he's fully healthy, could be that guy, because he did it for Georgia. He's done it in flashes for the Eagles. He just needs to be on the field. He has to be reliable this year.
That's the thing, Gino, is linebacker hasn't really ever been a position the Eagles win because of, but at least when you had TJ Edwards, you weren't losing because of this position.
There you go.
The tackling, the communication was so solid. Even with Kyzir White, 2022, those two weren't amazing, but you never lost because of those guys. They were always rock solid. You knew what you were getting every single game, whereas last year, there were so many injuries, but even the guys that were out there when they were healthy, the tackling was abysmal, and they didn't have that leader. And I think that's the biggest question heading into the year at this position is, can Nakobe Dean be that green dot player? Can he be the guy they thought was the steal of the draft in 2022 from the third round, where we thought him and Devin Lloyd were the top two talents at that position? He should maybe be a day one pick. He falls to the third round. Can he become that player and overcome these injury issues? Or is he just another Sidney Jones that we say we stole on day two, right? And he just can't overcome those injury problems. That's kind of the territory he's getting into this year if he doesn't take that jump.
I think one thing that we haven't brought up much, but that has to be remembered in all of these discussions when it comes to personnel, it's year 3 for a lot of these guys.
Yeah.
Jordan Davis, now Nakobe Dean. This is the season where the evaluation, it comes to fruition.
Yeah, you don't get 4 years, Gino. It's 2 to 3, and then you are who you are.
They're going to make a decision at this position beyond this year based on what they get out of this group. Now, let's talk about the positives with this group. I think you have a high ceiling when it comes to athleticism between Devin White and Nakobe Dean. Jeremiah Trotter, he'll work his way onto the field, but those two guys, you are at least are going to get Devin White's ability to go and rush the passer, be used in some of those sets that we were talking about with the defensive line, where you can run these linebacker, tackle, edge stunts. He's quick getting downhill. He's quick getting sideline to sideline. Now, if he can be the player that Tampa wanted him to be when they drafted him, even 75% of that, you're looking at a pretty good tandem. And that's what you need, is at least two guys to do their job and not be a group that you lose games because of. Now, the biggest question mark to me, Lou, is the best linebacker in 2023 for the Philadelphia Eagles, Zach Cunningham. Could he potentially find his way back onto this team?
Yeah, he is still a free agent. And if Devin White doesn't take that step this year, become the guy he was in the 2020 Super Bowl season for Tampa Bay, or even 2021, 2022, he went 3 straight years where he had over 100 tackles. He had a 9-sack season. He had 5.5 2 years ago. Like, if you don't get that version of Devin White, Nakobe Dean can't stay healthy, you might need to call up Zach Cunningham, who was pretty solid. He was probably your most consistent linebacker last year. But, I really hope it doesn't come down to that. I think between Devin White, Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter, one of those guys has to pan out where they can be the player you rely on every down. And I hope it's Trotter or Dean, because then for Devin White, he can do what he does best, and it's just come downhill, read and react. Like, you don't really want him probably being your green dot player, even though it's been great to see him take on a more vocal, like, leadership role with a new team in Philly. You want Dean or Trotter to have that position so White can kind of just flow to the ball, because I think that's where he fits best. That's why Levante David was perfect for Devin White.
And let's be real with Devin White. Is he in the Eagles' plans in the future? You
He's
can't say that.
He's 26, though, and he's more talented than anybody at the spot that they have, I think.
But you can't say that confidently based on what
deal.
the Eagles have done at this position. It's 1 year, and let the guys walk outside of TJ Edwards.
If he plays really well, Gino, he might outplay Philadelphia. They might just let him walk.
And what did TJ Edwards and Kyzir White get? Kyzir White got a $4 million deal, and the Eagles didn't even want to touch
Edwards
that number.
Got, what, 6? I mean,
6 from Chicago and maybe a little hometown discount. But you know how he isn't going to invest money there. So you have to hope that the guy that you've paid the most money to at that position in the last couple of years, which is crazy that they're paying him in upwards of $7.5 million if he does reach all of his incentives, he's got to be on the football field and contribute in the ways that you said, right? Like 9.5 sacks. Is he going to hit that number? Probably not. But if you could get a solid 5 out of a player like Devin White and allow Nakobe Dean to just do what he has done in his career and be that more Mike type of backer, see the field, flow to the ball, read and react, that's going to be your best duo. Because at the same time, Lou, outside of the linebacker position, which we will get to, the safeties are going to be pseudo linebackers to an extent as well.
Sure.
You're going to see guys like Zach Baun, who are brought in primarily as a pass rushing kind of jack type of linebacker who's going to stand up more often than not. He's going to get some snaps there as well. And how does a guy like Oreon Burks, who this team had signed to bring special team snaps to this unit, can he be in the equation? And same with Ben Van Summer. And outside of those top 2 guys, and if they're not healthy, it brings even more question marks to the position. But the depth of this group, it's better than it was in 2023.
Agreed.
But I don't know if they have the potential to get to that 2022 group if one of those top 2 guys are out.
No, I don't think so. Like you said, though, the good thing is you have a much better secondary this year with a lot more options. So that was the problem, Gino, last year. You didn't just suffer injuries at linebacker. It was also a corner and safety. So you didn't have anybody to really make up for the loss of TJ Edwards and Kyzir White or Chauncey Gardner-Johnson on that second and third level. Whereas this year, even if you don't have the linebacker play of 2022, if it kind of is like last year, I think they'll still be okay because they're going to run some DB-heavy looks. But I will say, between Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., and Devin White, I am pretty confident right now one of those guys will be a big upgrade over what you had last year. Because at least 2 of the 3, like Dean and White, at one point in their career, show that they were special. Like, both of them did that at one point. So at least you know you have that potential. Last year, outside of Dean, you didn't really have that in anybody. Even Jeremiah Trotter Jr. has been one of the best linebackers in the country over the last few years that many thought would be a 2nd or 3rd round pick.
Now that you're talking about this group, I'm kind of looking at it like the position on the opposite side of the ball where the Eagles have kind of pinch their pennies a little bit and looking at running back, last year's group to me in Zach Cunningham and Nicholas Morrow. I was blanking on his name for a second. That almost feels like that Josh Adams, Wendell Smallwood season.
Mm-hmm.
If you can at least get decent play out of one of those guys and the secondary can do enough and the front can hit home, you can win 10 out of 11 games. They did it. They did it in the first stretch of the season.
They always do it.
Can you get a better floor than that, though? I believe you can.
I think so.
If Nakobe Dean is out, we keep going back to the if. There's so many, especially at linebacker, the question marks are huge. It feels like the Riddler from Batman is just going off in my head with this position. Like, what happens if one of the dominoes falls? What happens if two of the dominoes falls? Do they have a plan B? What happens if they get to C and D? Because offensive coordinators in the past, Lou, they've realized that linebacker, when it's a weakness for the Eagles, we can target it over and over and over again. And look at how wide open the middle of the field was for passing offenses and running offenses against the Eagles defense last year.
We'll get into those depth options coming up next as we continue to preview linebacker right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle to level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are previewing linebacker, which continues to be an unknown for the Eagles. That pretty much is the case every single year. Nakobe Dean, Devin White, the projected starters, but Jeremiah Trotter Jr., again, this is a 5th-round pick, and of course it's a great story as his dad is one of the best middle linebackers in franchise history. But I will say, Trotter's not somebody to overlook because of the question marks of Dean and White. I would not be surprised at all if Trotter is I've said this a lot on the show before, he's your new TJ Edwards, where every year you're saying, well, we hope this guy becomes the player or this guy. And it was always TJ Edwards, right? But you wanted the players with the higher ceiling, but those guys had a much lower floor. I think that's the same case with Dean and White. I would not be surprised if Trotter Jr., he's not the flashier player at this position, but he becomes your most reliable one. He was always at Clemson in the right spots. His leadership, his tackling, that was his MO. He does give me Edwards vibes a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a pretty solid steal on day 3.
I believe that's a good way to approach the situation with Jeremiah Trotter Jr., and I think everything is kind of worked out well for Jr., because if you look at where he was drafted, our concern was, are you going to draft him on day 2, which is going to be an overdraft? Because
we thought so, yeah.
What you said, his ceiling. What is this player's ceiling? He doesn't run the tests. Concerns about his athleticism.
Mm-hmm.
He potentially is going to struggle in the pass game due to those athleticism concerns. He's undersized. But you get him in the 5th round, and now you're saying, okay, we've met our value at where we take linebackers.
Right.
He's in a room that there is nothing set in stone. And I keep going back to the point that I had mentioned after the draft, who is going to get what it is to be a Philadelphia Eagle and play defense for the Eagles more than Jeremiah Trotter Jr. There's absolutely nobody in that building. And that could be one of those things, one of those intangibles that you really can't measure. But I believe it's a good way to approach this position where he is going to be a high floor type of player, where if he's your 11th best guy on defense, you can still win games and not lose games because of Jeremiah Trotter Jr.
I think, yeah, that's the scenario that would play out where, again, you hope Dean or White does become the guy because there is a higher ceiling there. But the Eagles have won in spite of linebacker for almost my entire life. And if that's the scenario that plays out where you're not really winning because of the position and you don't have a bona fide star there, like, to me, in my head, I'd say, oh, that's because Nakobe Dean, Devin White, they didn't work out. And Trotter Jr. was just so solid that, like you said, he can be your 10th or 11th best player on that line. And sure, is he going to make, huge plays every week? No, but you're never going to, again, he's not going to be a Nate Geary. And that's all that matters is you can't lose because of this position. And you did because of Nate Geary in 2020. You did lose because of Nicholas Morrow at times in 2023. I think Trotter Jr., again, the IQ, the intangibles, the leadership, that's going to get him through where he can, to a certain degree, overcome the obstacles of what we're talking about, the athleticism and the size issues.
And does that happen right away as a rookie? Probably is going to take a little bit longer. It didn't happen with
Edwards right away, Gino, in 2019. It took him a few years.
Exactly. But if he knows where to be on the football field, that's going to be his biggest asset. And if you can play and at least run, unlike Shaq Leonard did for you last year, where Shaq Leonard now is our Leotis McKelvin, but for the linebacker position where he just had absolutely nothing in the tank.
Nothing left.
Even though they have more bodies here that are going to probably give you better snaps, Lou, I still say that if there is a position on either side of the football that they were going to add another body, it would be linebacker before they get either to the end of training camp or heck, it could happen even before training camp starts.
I agree and then they have Oreon Burks, who you mentioned with San Francisco last year. I think he'll be a big part of the special teams unit. Zach Baun, you would want him to play edge more than stand-up linebacker.
Yeah, that's why we kind of grouped him there yesterday,
yes,
I would say.
Because he was better in New Orleans in that way. But I will say Vic Fangio, maybe it's because Dean was hurt and still working on the side, but Fangio was using Baun as a first-team linebacker on the inside next to Devin White. So maybe he thinks he is an option there. Fangio right now is kind of in experimental mode, though, so that's more where I take that. But, you're right, because outside of that, it's like, I like the upside of a Brandon Smith, but he's an unknown right now. They let Ben Van Sumeren, but they added a lot of guys in front of him this year. So I wouldn't be surprised. You mentioned Zach Cunningham earlier in the show. I think Cunningham would be the name I think they bring in if they do add somebody in the summer or if it's like, the beginning of the season.
The situation they cannot get into was exactly what happened last year, where you're trying to sign somebody.
Like Miles Jack in August just to get a body here. No.
You're in a better situation than you were last year already by having this group. And if is everything here. If you do have those two guys that start all 17 games for you, great. If you have to go to plan B, there's one guy that I want to get all the snaps, and it would be the biggest reason you don't add somebody. It's because Jeremiah Trotter Jr., he should just be thrown right into the fire, right? Like, figure out if he can play. It's going to be rough. It's going to be rocky. But if you're down Dean, you're down White, is Oreon Burks going to be the next guy up for you? Is Ben Van Sumeren going to be the next guy up for you? Like, let's be realistic. They actually drafted Jeremiah Trotter Jr. Howie Roseman, he did that for a reason. They see something in him. It's got to go to him if those two guys are out. And even if those two guys are healthy, Lou, you should still find ways to utilize him in sub packages because he's the only surefire thing you have on a rookie contract for at least 4 years. But besides that, this room is empty past 2024.
That's true. And it is good to know that you have Cunningham out there. I'll say for an August signing last year, Gino, like he was pretty solid. But for the most part, I think they have their guys in-house. What makes me feel better is what we talked about earlier is, again, it wasn't just that linebacker was bad. But at the same time, there were corner issues and safety. And there's so much talent those two spots now that I'm feeling a lot better that could also mask any issues that arise this year. That was the problem is, that's what you've had in years past. Like your linebackers sucked, but you had Malcolm Jenkins playing all over the formation. Like now you have
he was
Chauncey
almost
Gardner-Johnson.
A linebacker to an extent. Yeah,
exactly, and that's what CGJ can be, and Sidney Brown when he comes back, and so many these corners too have versatility. Like that. That's really what makes me feel the most comfortable.
You can't expect the linebackers to do anything beyond who they are as players. And what is that? You can't expect them to win games because of this unit. You just can't. But they, like we keep going back to, they can't be as bad as they were last year to where you're losing games because of them. But as you had said, rising tides lift all boats. Better safety play, better corner play, better guy calling and designing the defense. You're hoping that this unit should be much better going into 2024, because 2023 truly was rock bottom at this position, man. When has it been that bad? It was the depth of the NFL. There was nothing, at least in the Super Bowl season. Nigel Bradham was your saving grace. Like, he at least got you by.
Even in 2021, like, you look at who the starters were at the end of the year, and it was Alex Singleton and Davian Taylor. That would say, oh man, that was rock bottom. But those two were significantly better than anything you had last year.
Singleton's a stud here in Denver, man.
And Davian Taylor, believe it or not, in 2021, actually had some good games before he got hurt. Last year, when Shaq Leonard was getting snaps, like you mentioned, he reminded me a lot of Jay Ajayi when he came back in 2019, and there was like a 3rd and 3, and he couldn't beat a nose tackle to the edge, and you're like, oh, he's done. He can't run anymore. That's what I saw with Shaq Leonard last year. Like, this is a big name that used to be a good player, and he's got nothing left, like absolutely nothing.
And that's why I made that point about Jeremiah Trotter Jr., because if you're in a situation where you're like, oh, let's sign one of these vets that is available in the middle of October for a reason that I think 31 other teams wouldn't sign him, is exactly what happened with Shaq Leonard. If you're signing him to play over Jeremiah Trotter Jr., there's bigger questions about why you drafted Jeremiah Trotter Jr. in the first place. The guy coaching that position hasn't developed Jeremiah Trotter or any of the other guys to take those snaps. And Howie Roseman, we say he has learned from the areas he's been wrong in the past. That would just ultimately prove he hasn't learned at linebacker. He just has not learned, if that's the situation. But he's going into this year, I believe, with this plan being plan A, B, C, and D. That this is going to work out. They believe they can get at least good enough play out of those two guys at backer with the rotation of the other guys, and at least not lose them games like Shaq Leonard and the rest of that group did last year.
Exactly. And the last thing I'll say is, again, I think they want to get back to that floor, but at least they do have some sort of potential for more. And there's been times where even when the floor is high, it never felt like there was this possible star-like ceiling. And I do think between Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., Devin White, one of them could be a very, very good player. Not saying it's going to happen. Gino keeps saying it's a huge if. But I think this year it's a more exciting group than in past seasons for sure. We'll finish off with some stat over-unders at linebacker as we wrap up this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, we're wrapping up this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles, previewing the linebacker position as training camp is almost here at the NovaCare Complex in Philadelphia. We've got the secondary tomorrow as we wrap up our positional previews. And, Gino, as we do each show, we'll finish things off with stat over-unders at linebacker. And you look at the numbers last year, it's actually kind of crazy. Nicholas Morrow and Zach Cunningham were 2nd and 3rd for your team in tackles with 95 and 85. Morrow actually had 3 sacks last year, too, was used a little bit in the blitz game early on in the year. I think when you look at those two, when you look at the numbers, I would hope, again, as you mentioned, like they can get back to even maybe not 2022, but get back to some sort of floor. I'd want to take the over on those numbers between Devin White and Nakobe Dean. But the big what if is, can they stay healthy? Like, that's one thing that last year those guys were on the field, but they just weren't very good. This year, I think the players have a lot more talent, but there's more injury questions.
So the thing about tackles is you can make those up elsewhere, right? You can make those up with Reed Blankenship and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Cooper DeJean and the rest of the guys that they brought in. The area that I'm really interested in is that sack number. You look at Nicholas Morrow of 3. If Devin White can give you anything past that, I think that's a win of a signing right off the bat. Now, Nakobe Dean, how do you measure success for him this season? It's probably him gaining anywhere close to 100 tackles, which means take away what the tackles mean. It's one of the most useless stats in football. But if he's out there 400 tackles, that means that he was healthy for 17 games and you got exactly what you needed to out of him. So if you say over on that tackle number, Lou, you're hoping that these guys had played together for a majority of the snaps, which is probably the best case scenario for this group as a whole.
Devin White's numbers, when you look at 2020, 2021, and 2022, they were pretty good. 140 tackles, 128, then 124. He had sack seasons of 9, 3.5, and 5.5. And again, it's a big if, but Vic Fangio, if he can get Devin White like that player, I'm not saying he's suddenly going to be like a top 5 linebacker when it comes to like coverage grade. I don't think that's him. I don't think he's going to be a green dot every down player. But if you can get that explosiveness out of him, right, just use him in that way and just, again, use him to his strengths but hide his weaknesses, like you can still get a pretty effective player. I'm not saying he's going to be an all-pro again like he was 4 years ago, but I think those numbers, like he used to have, like he would load up the box score in Tampa.
It's almost like how Kansas City was using Trent McDuffie at the cornerback position for a while, where he was just an edge rusher and he was just getting after the quarterback. It's like, yeah, Devin White, let him be the guy that kind of lines up in these advantageous matchups to use his speed and his athleticism to get the best out of some of these guys and go blow up a line or running back in pass protection and get to the quarterback. Because like you had said, Lou, is he going to be a top coverage backer? No, that's not who he is. Who is going to be that guy out of this group? Hopefully none of them. Hopefully it's a completely different position that is taking those snaps. Hopefully that's Chauncey. Hopefully that's Reed. Hopefully that's Sidney Brown. Hopefully that's on tomorrow's show when we talk more about that. But what these guys need to do is, one, be in there for 17 games for continuity, play calling, and stopping the run, because the middle of the field, it was like the Red Sea for most teams running the football last year. And two, find a way to be a sixth guy in that pass rush to get after the quarterback. So if you can get both of these guys as a group to 7.5 sacks, which Nakobe Dean, he's been around the quarterback when he has been on the field as well. You're looking at a pretty good group that you haven't had in past years.
I'm excited to watch it. Linebacker is continuously a big if for the Philadelphia Eagles, but there is a lot more potential this year, I'd say, than in years past. We'll see if they meet that ceiling or if they hit that lower floor. We'll continue to cover the Eagles right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast with our positional previews. Tomorrow is the secondary, so make sure you stay tuned on YouTube and all podcast platforms. Thanks as always for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.